Yeah, thanks for coming to the mall. This is really cool and fun. Thanks for coming. Thanks to Bonny. And this is a second talk that I'm doing with Bonny that's related to a bigger project that I'm doing about mimesis that kind of started. It started actually a few years ago when I was studying with one of the people that I'll cite today, who wrote a book called Mimesis and Alterity. And then later on, years later in grad school, I started to pick up mimesis again and sort of think about it as more than... Can you guys hear me? Okay. Good. Oh, not really? Okay. That maybe mimesis is... it's typically defined as imitation pretty plainly, but I was suspecting that it's much more than that. I'm not the only person, obviously, to have that suspicion or to kind of want to interrogate further into the concept to see what more can offer. So the first talk that I did with Bonny was about mimesis and animandieta. So I examined animandieta's relationship with mimesis as a deeper form of relational practice beyond superficial imitation. Animandieta also said something about there being a universal energy that flows through everything that I felt was really connected to the way I was starting to conceive of mimesis. And then that talk was building it, like I said, on earlier academic work I had done about mimesis and Michael Asher, the California conceptual artist, whose interventions were, I argue, mimetic and revelatory, exposing the hidden structures that shape perception and institutional space. So today I'll talk about how I continued this project of developing a more full-fledged concept of mimesis by discussing my incomplete pseudo-replication of Flight Stop in the form of center of pressure, which is the goose that's hanging at the gallery. So that pseudo-replication was a move that was enabled and informed by Elaine Sturdivant's artworks and writings, definitely. And they deal with members of the same set of problems that I'm taking up in my articulation of mimesis. So that would be the organizing principles of hierarchical arrangements of authenticity, what purposes those arrangements might serve, and what mimesis can reveal about the fidelity of those arrangements and those delineations. So that will then imply a kind of political import, as it will discuss the oppressive force of alienation through categorizations, as categories are a very powerful tool of oppression, and the potential emancipatory power that mimesis offers as a sort of counterforce to that. And this time I'm also introducing the concept of methexis as perhaps a coextensive counterpart to mimesis, and I'll explain all that. So then, of course, as the title of the talk also says, we are thinking about what it means to give way. And so this is the seed of the talk, actually, and it came directly from some text fragments of Michael Snow's that I found in the Flight Stop archive at the AGO and had been thinking about in the months leading up to Bonny's inviting me to do the show. So in the fragment, which seemed, I think, just like there were drafts of statements and drafts of things throughout the archives. I think it was just a sort of iteration of a statement that he was probably going to provide to Cadillac Fairview, who are the owners of this mall and this artwork. But anyway, in this statement, he kind of describes the perceptual logic of Flight Stop, and it's a clear and intentional account of the structural transformation that the work is meant to provoke in the viewer. So he wrote, while of course the work is sculpture, the fact that it is composed of what are in a sense flying, actually floating, three-dimensional photographs is an important part of the concept. In this work, as in all my work with photography, there will be an attempt to involve the spectator in the nature of representation, in the art officiality of images in relation to their subjects. This work will be one of stylized naturalism. The group effect will be initially very realistic, as thrilling in a way as seeing an actual group of Canada geese, but this feeling should give way to an experiencing of it as static representational sculpture, an enjoyment of the groups and subgroups of form that will be revealed as one changes one's point of view in relation to the group and can become involved in looking at the characteristics of individual geese sculptures. So the phrase give way stood out here because it seemed like it could capture an operative gesture involved in mimesis. It's creating an opening between two experiences, two feelings, two concepts, or sets of concepts. So rather than concealing its artificiality, the artwork delays its legibility in order to reconfigure the viewer's perceptual field. So importantly, it is considerate of the viewer, of the other, as if the work itself is conscious of its context and prepared to open up. And so this aligns with what the anthropologist Michael Taussig describes in his book Mimesis and Alterity, which was the professor that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. So he describes in his book Mimesis and Alterity, which has been pretty central to this overall project, he wrote about yielding in this discussion of mimesis, which I will get more into, but is a relation allowing boundaries to thin, open, dissolve into affinity or a kind of unity. And so it's a passing through and an entry, crossing of a threshold, or like to give way. So that's what that means. And then, of course, like why we're at the mall. So this context of the mall matters as well to this. The mall is, as Jimmy, who gave a talk at the gallery on Tuesday, he described the mall as a third space, which is a privately owned public space with intentional considerations about relationality kind of built into that. Flight Stop, owned by Cadillac Fairview, is a privately owned public work. So it's related in that sense. But Jimmy's elucidation of the third space, as drawn from the three scenes in classical architecture, is highly relevant to the examination of mimesis that's going to come forward, and methexis. And so Jimmy read a passage from Aaron Betsky's 1997 book Queer Space that I'm going to now repeat. The third scene is a more difficult to describe. It's the scene of myths, of stories of which you do not know whether they are true or not, or the everyday and the miraculous mix. It takes place in a mixture of the man-made and the natural, the real and the imagined. It presents a framework that shows us our own society in a mirror that reveals both its temporality and its order, its natural beauty and its artifice. So it's a confusing space that deals a lot in things blending together, what's real, what's not real. That's very much the territory of mimesis and methexis in the context of today. So blending together, layering, giving way to one another are these, let's say, like representations of varying fidelity. It's a slippery place. There's an interpenetrability between concepts, between individuals, between categories. This is going to be like a repeating motif. So the distinctions are porous and lateral in like a multi-directional way. And in the mall and in the commercial depictions that populate the space visually and conceptually, we're sort of shrouded in this confusing real, not real place, and being not so subtly coerced into going along with the narratives that are importantly asking us to opt in to an affinity or to identify or to participate or to give way, and to allow oneself to be taken up into like that display and identify with those guys. So it's important now, I guess, to lay the groundwork for both mimesis and methexis. So I'll situate us with a summary of how the concepts are going to be entered into this discussion. So my approach to mimesis so far draws primarily from Walter Benjamin's writings on the mimetic faculty that he developed in the early 1930s in the Doctrine of the Similar and on the mimetic faculty. According to Walter Benjamin, the mimetic faculty is a primordial, pre-linguistic, pre-rational faculty that's a means of perceiving and forming similarity that cuts across nature, ritual, language, and relation. This faculty is like a force of correspondence, and importantly, not simply a technique, but it's a way in which the self and other recognize each other and furthermore enter into one another if so inclined. And so this line of thinking is taken up again and expanded by Michael Taussig, as I said, especially where he describes mimesis as correspondence and puts it in the context of sympathetic magic, and that idea that things can influence each other at a distance through resemblance or contact, even when no physical connection remains. It's called magic because it assumes a non-causal metaphysical link and something that works through affinity or likeness, as opposed to something that works through a mechanical or empirically legible cause and effect relation. So anthropologically, that sympathetic magic has two main forms. There's imitative magic, where like affects like, It's like a voodoo doll. Or contagious magic, where once touched things remain linked. So doing spell work with a lock of somebody's hair or something. So the goal of sympathetic magic is to exert influence or transformation through the symbolic or mimetic relation, to produce real effects through resemblance or shared substance. And that's why Tausig uses it as a way to think about mimesis as a participatory and transformative act, where likeness is a medium of real connection. Here we have entanglement, a ritual and social practice that alters both the subject and object, or subject and subject. So again, Michael Tausig offers a really powerful reading of Adorno and Horkheimer's account of mimesis in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, which I strongly endorse. So he says, mimesis, once a dominant practice and component of knowing, becomes in Western historical development a repressed presence, not so much erased by Enlightenment science and practice as distorted and used as a hidden force. So during the Enlightenment era, science became the predominant way of developing knowledge. It was the only way to make a valid epistemological claim. And mimesis and these kinds of ritualistic things were considered to be illusory and misleading and invalid in terms of developing any real knowledge or anything productive. That's on an intellectual side, but at the same time, there's a huge colonial aspect to all of this, where it isn't just about the mimesis, it's about the people empowering themselves through their mimetic practices that also had to be, subjugated and tucked away, so to say the least. So that reading that Tausig gave is one that I endorse, and it situates mimesis as a suppressed epistemology. So it's a displaced but persistent mode of knowing and relating, repressed and obscured by the prioritization of instrumental reason, but still operative beneath the surface of modernity. And one of my main arguments that relates to that is science. I have a science degree. Science is extremely mimetic practice. Like, you're literally, in many cases, trying to replicate an exact copy of something that's going on in the real world in order to be able to control it and make a prediction or have an outcome that you desire by recreating circumstances or conditions. So science is doing mimesis, it's just not calling it that. So to understand how this suppression was staged, we have to return to the philosophical origin point of mimesis, which is Plato's Republic. So there, mimesis was introduced and then basically immediately cast under suspicion. So Plato describes mimetic activity, especially artistic representation, as a third-order copy removed from truth and capable of misleading the soul. And in this schema, the artist is twice removed from the form, producing seductive illusions that threaten to destabilize the rational order of the polis, right? So this is within the theory of the forms, which I'll continue to explain. So mimesis for Plato is therefore a degraded form of knowledge and a political threat. And by his account, it draws desire toward the perceptual and away from the ideal, toward fake and away from real. And so from its very entry into Western philosophical thought, mimesis is marked as dangerous, as a disruptive force to be subjugated and contained, lest it interfere with the governance of truth, form, and social order. But thankfully, I guess, Aristotle partially rehabilitated mimesis by, of course, linking it to catharsis in his Poetics and proposing that mimetic representation, especially in tragedy, could have some utility through an ethical and emotional value by provoking a purgation of fear and pity. And so this reframed mimesis as a psychologically or socially useful, allowing it to persist within aesthetic discourse even as its deeper relational structure remained more or less constrained. But this is how and why we see it subjugated later as a sort of instrumental rationality within art making, which is the same claim that Adorno would make. Adorno and Horkheimer would also argue that mimesis just gets, it gets to go play in the sandbox in the world of art and be used as a technique for art making. It's nothing more than that, which it very much, they don't say that it's nothing more than that. It is more than that, but that's how it was handled historically. So my reading of this moment and my alignment with later critical theorists is that Plato's move was not simply epistemological but strategic. By locating mimesis in the realm of illusion, he neutralized its power as a mode of relational and perceptual transformation. And so what I want to do here is, I guess, part of this project is to restore that power and track how it continues to function and how it may provide us with emancipatory, politically efficacious things. I'll make a brief but important caveat here that my concept of mimesis here does not draw on René Girard's theory of the mimetic desire, and especially not on the instrumentalized reading promoted by Peter Thiel and others of that same ilk. So that framework casts mimesis as a competitive mechanism that's rooted in scarcity, envy, and violence, and it interprets similarity as a threat and structures desire as acquisitive and antagonistic. And my concern is obviously very different. I'm not interested in the desire to possess what the other possesses, but in the structure of being with, of entering into resonance, of becoming altered by contact. The Thiel-Girard frame evacuates mimesis of its aesthetic, perceptual, and ontological force. It flattens a relational structure into a market logic of competition, and it is, in my opinion, an intentional misappropriation that is nothing more than a shoddy intellectual justification for sociopathic greed. So when I speak of mimesis here, I mean it in the sense of non-identical resemblance, of responsive entanglement, of yielding, transformation through relation, a primordial, prediscursive, affective, structural de-alienating in a sort of peaceful, defiant indifference to category, therefore perhaps offering a great deal of emancipatory power in many contexts that can be generative of conditions of possibility. So this is obviously very speculative, and it's important to note also that if I'm proposing mimesis as some kind of maybe inviolable law or force, like gravity or something, then I'm also required to acknowledge its neutrality, meaning it isn't inherently good or bad. It's just a constitutive element of our reality that we just live with, but we can choose how to engage it, similar to gravity. And so that is where the generative qualities will come from, in the choices in how you engage with them. So Methexis, if mimesis describes the structure of resemblance, then Methexis describes the structure of participation. And Jean-Luc Nancy has like a really good, he describes this relationship between Methexis and mimesis really well, so I'm just going to read that. Participation, Methexis, is indeed intrinsic to the mimetic relationship, to the relation of imitation. If I want to imitate Hercules or Dionysus, I cannot just reproduce their external form. I must also embrace internally the movement and passion that are at play. It's precisely this participation which, for Plato, seems to be susceptible of unleashing uncontrolled passions. So there's, from the outset, like a really complicated, conflating relationship between mimesis and Methexis that Plato's trying to enforce a difference between the two. So it enters the philosophical record through Plato, where it's framed as the proper, sanctioned way that something relates to a form. A beautiful object is not the form of beauty itself, but it participates in that form. And so it shares in its essence, but without imitating its appearance. It's different. And you can see how like that logic is weaponized all the way up into like postmodernity, right? It's like, oh, I prefer natural beauty over somebody who wears makeup. That's the difference between mimesis and Methexis, which is like a false hierarchical distinction. That's oppressive. So in contrast to mimesis, Plato condemns that as an illusion and distortion. Methexis is granted legitimacy, and it becomes the authorized means of relation, and it's safe because it supposedly maintains the boundary between what is and what is not. But this distinction is not neutral and is presented as ontological, as a matter of being, but it's performing political work. It exists to manage how relation is permitted to occur. So Methexis is the version of relationality that can be controlled, classified, stabilized, while mimesis is cast out as unstable, excessive, and threatening. And so the paradox becomes pretty clear. Participating is already in some way to become like. So Methexis blurs or bleeds into mimesis, or they're somehow in lockstep, or they're somehow coextensive from the get. So the line between the two that's so essential to Plato's schema is not really philosophically stable. So what he calls Methexis may always have carried the mimetic within it. And so the repression of mimesis also depends on a false containment of Methexis. So both of them are like just being falsely defined. So what I want to suggest, they're constructed, but they are actually real things. So what I want to suggest is that these are not opposites, but two names for the same relational structure, differently framed depending on what's being policed or what's being permitted. So methexis can be understood as the regulated surface of a deeper mimetic entanglement. So to return to mimesis is not to discard participation, but to insist that participation has always already been transformation and involved in that. So paradox and contradiction is important here. Mimesis is structurally paradoxical because it entails the subject being both itself and not itself, self and other simultaneously. So it's engaging resemblance without resolution and inhabiting a simultaneous relation of difference and similarity, and that's a constitutive feature of it. So it's like, in order to be the same, you have to also be different, so you're both, and then that's like a contradiction, right? Logically. So methexis, as defined by Plato, is structured to avoid that kind of contradiction. It describes a regulated, obedient form that's hierarchical, teleological, and ontologically distinct from the form that it partakes in, but when examined through the mimetic frame, its boundary with mimesis becomes unstable, as I established. So methexis is not paradoxical by design, but it depends on the repression of paradox in order to function. So in classical logic, when you arrive at a paradox or a contradiction in a logical progression, you reach a contradiction that is called the principle of explosion, or a principle called ex contradictione quodlibet, which means from contradiction anything follows, which means that once a system admits both P and not P, any conclusion can be derived. So anything goes. Categories become meaningless. It's, unicorns exist, everything. So this is the kind of instability that mimesis introduces, because it unsettles the categorical separations by kind of just being the contradiction that allows for anything to go. There are paraconsistent logics that do permit contradiction without rendering a system trivial, and they reflect in formal terms the mimetic structure of entangled relation that's non-identical and co-present and unresolved. But I think in the classical logic sense is where you would have the threat, because it's on a classical philosophical paradigm. So mimesis and its tension with methexis demonstrates that contradiction need not be dismissed. It may be the ground condition of relation itself. So now we can go back to replica. My instinct, for whatever reason, was to make replicas of the flight stop geese, but adapted to suit the conditions of conditions. So maybe it would make just 3 to fit in the space, for instance. But upon endeavoring this, the constraints became much more deterministic on the outcome of the work. The limited resources of time, space, money, ability really dictated the outcome of the goose, which was the most honest approach I could take, was to allow that to just happen, right? So I would have done an exact replica if I could have, and I probably will, but it was important to be honest about the making of this replica and in the context that it was being done. So I made an incomplete pseudo-replica of Flight Stop, which was self-consciously like a Povera-style impression, copy of a copy, but even more degraded copy. And so the traces of its adaptive negotiations ended up aligning with the broader logic of this project and happened to materialize some of the conceptual issues at stake, such as resemblance, authorship, category, merit or value in copy, or the hierarchy of reality, and all that. Making a replica, even a partial one, activates a mimetic mode, of course, an entanglement that appears in the form of the replica itself. And while this project takes replication, this center of pressure project, the sculpture itself, takes replication as its entry point, mimesis, as I've said, isn't reducible to imitation. So just as a quick aside, I earlier mentioned that I worked through some of Michael Asher's work to show how it was mimetic, but without having that visual resemblance or that representational, sort of vestigial representational notion attached to it. So a good example is Michael Asher's 1974 intervention at Clare Copley Gallery in Los Angeles, where he just removed the wall that separated the gallery from the office space. And it dissolved the categorical boundary between art and commerce, revealing their structural proximity and likeness. So it was a mimetic operation enacted through spatial and institutional realignment, but not through visual resemblance per se, though in merging what had been held apart, it ultimately produced visual resemblance as well, because what had been two separate zones was rendered perceptually continuous. But you see the point that although like what I was doing here was this kind of related to this notion of mimesis that I'm trying to take it away from, it's still relevant, and it encompasses all of these different approaches. So anyway, importantly, mimesis is contextual rather than categorical. So it doesn't assert any fixed epistemic claims. It just moves through and across all those kinds of limits in a situational manner, in an almost Heraclitean way. Like it just can just adapt and shift. So either way, replication is the mode that I'm working with this sculpture. So making a replica, even an imperfect one, invokes Elaine Sturdivant for me. So her work established replication as structural critique above and beyond reference, appropriation, or pastiche, or parody. Her replicas, in their apparent perfection, operated within the logic of the system in order to expose its internal tensions, pressing up on originality, authorship, and the politics of aesthetic value by repeating them too precisely. So now I'm going to read a short text by Sturdivant written for a Tate Modern workshop on the concept of the replica that she wrote in 2007, which speaks directly to the contradictions I've been tracing. It's called Inherent Vice or Vice Versa. There's the inside and the outside. There's the interior and the exterior, not as in the Foucault fold, but as in essence, force, and potency, the interior silent power of art. And it is here that hovers the entangled challenge of replication. Replica is not a copy, but it could be. Replica might be a double, but its sameness will trip us up. Replica could never be repetition, for repetition is difference. Replica might be repeating, but that is all surface. Replica could be redo and remake, but it is in your face cyber, so we can jet that, or maybe not. Copy, of course, has the absolute beauty of looking just like the real thing, but copy conceals dangerous gaps. The rigid technique required to make an exact, detailed copy renders it without force. The artwork becomes static and dead. There's no opposition or confrontation. It is incapable of imposing and creating action. Such denial of critical elements in a work of art is like denying the artist's most powerful implement. Voila, this is a no-go. Double has the spectacular problem of sameness, which works for replication except for this burden, for in our cybernetic world, same is temporal appearance empty. And there is dilemma of nothing can be the same in a finite and infinite world. The placing of this limitation is, of course, limited to works of art, indeed not to the vast double of language. So does it work for replication or not? Maybe yes, maybe no. Replication is a breathtaking conceptual idea that has greatly pushed the limitation of resemblance, holding the higher powers of non-identity and difference. Its presence has narrowed the gap between visibilities and articulation. If one could jump over the dynamics of difference, this would be an excellent method for replication. However, the crucial leap from image to concept, this displacement of image that throws out representation, might not be the best place for replication to go. Certainly it would possess veracity, but unfortunately eliminate the artist. Repeating might be an excellent mode for replicating, but it's back to the surface again. It desperately cares what it looks like rather than containing silent power, which is of no interest. This digital process is image over image and used by Warhol with brilliance. Cybernetics' imposition on how we act, think, feel our mode of being is perhaps an advantage for the art of replicating. It releases this high anxiety of being original. Original's no longer viable, having long ago met its demise. This trap, our obsession with what lies on the surface, is prevalent everywhere. It's not a question of getting rid of these potent elements and not knowing it could be there. Its blatant absence is in high gear in most of our current art, whose push and shove is production and consumption, or burdened by heavy subjectivity, or hiding behind anonymity, or displaying our vast barren interior. By retreating to aggressive teeny bopper imagery, the interior of art, the understructure, is being concisely and brutally eliminated. Our digital shift from seeing to listening also has dire consequences for art. Seeing, which is not seeing, has been replaced by listening. Plug in your ears, listen to every bitsy detail, and hear the endless narrative of forget how one can fall in love with a painting or a sculpture, forget being breathless with its vigor and audacity. Spectators bringing to mind gladiators being eaten alive by lions only demand entertainment. Thus, seeing is only perception and hearing is only distraction. But not so for visibilities which bring to see to its highest power. However, the strenuous requirements of thinking, knowledge, references, reflection, and to be there are a great impediment in our anti-intellectual world. These vital elements are considered heavy baggage or are totally out of the digiloop. The fight, rebellion, and all the weight and drive of a work of art should present in a valid replica. As such, copy is out, double is out, repetition is out, repeating is out, redo and remake are definitely out. However, if one takes a philosophical position, it becomes clear that this idea of a critical interior is archaic. After all, it is deeply embedded in our cyberfold. Then copy, double, and repeating become a possible method for replication, but it's a bit of a cheat, isn't it? And what about those who know? Having found resolution for the inherent vice of replication, perhaps it has been agitated by all these paradoxes and contradictions. So, before I move on, I'll just say, when she refers to the Foucault fold, she's referencing Deleuze's 1986 book, Foucault, in which the fold becomes a way of thinking about interiority and exteriority as topological, a matter of curvature and inflection rather than division. It's a rich theoretical thread with relevance to this discussion as well, but I'll just have to leave it aside. I just want to acknowledge it. So there. So how are we doing? Are we okay? There's like 5-6 more minutes. Okay. Now I'm going to get into something a little bit more, maybe more of a pop culture reference, and referring back to Sturtevant's line about copy, of course, has the absolute beauty of looking just like the real thing, but copy conceals dangerous gaps. Those dangerous gaps, such as between self and other, real, not real, all that stuff, get taken up in, I think, this body of work by Nathan Fielder called The Rehearsal. So under the premise of a documentary or reality-style transparency, the audience is escorted through this logic and the recursive replication of reality as both a state of the world and a TV format nested within each other in a mimetic relation. He invests in tangents that seem to make no sense in the schema of instrumental reality. It's absurd, but also very open to giving way. But it doesn't, so it's almost like an open mockery of instrumental rationality. And then also there's a meticulous consideration of self and other. There's like an attentiveness, a stepping into others' identities and minds, role-playing, mentally envisioning outcomes, repetition, engaging in ritual. All is a grand mimetic and methectic project. So all of that kind of culminates into what I perceive as this grand mimetic methectic project that just demonstrates mimetic modes without having to talk about it like I am, because it obviously gets really complicated and muddy and you end up repeating yourself a lot and talking about all these confusing things, whereas when you're able to just watch it be demonstrated in this way, you just get what's happening and you experience the disorientation of the interrelation of mimesis and methexis. And of course changes do take place that bring us back to Tausig and the sympathetic magic. The resemblance does have a potency and a purpose, like those exact replications are designed to have particular outcomes that they sometimes do. So sympathetic magic, again, it's a transformation through proximity. And so the mimetic act generates a change in the world, and that's the force that the rehearsal is staging, a procedural form of magic where the ritual of rehearsal produces effects that exceed its intention. We know he's into magic in the performing art sense, but it seems that he's taking it further with mimesis here. So ultimately it reveals the instability of roles, the absurdity of control, the unreliability of categories themselves. And it comes off as a mockery or a critique of the dominant systems and their fallibility. So maybe like Sturtevant, that body of work of Nathan Fielder's, presses on systems by reproducing them too precisely and revealing some messy entanglement and nonsense in the dominant order, right? So then this is the final piece. I guess I could just go. With regard to the entanglement, the field of physics offers a proof. So the field of physics might offer a proof. So if I'm pitching this idea of mimesis and methexis together as some kind of like force or law and constitutive thing of our reality, then the field of physics offers proof, potentially. The discourses of quantum mechanics and relational physics have, over the past century, converged on an insight that renders the assumptions of classical metaphysics, discreteness, identity, bro. They're noobs. Yeah. Maybe I'm not supposed to say this part. Can you guys still hear me if I talk over it? Oh, okay. I can't tell. So maybe physics actually offers something by way of proof of this idea that there's some kind of law. So quantum physics is kind of challenging the assumptions of classical metaphysics, which are discreteness, identity, and individuation, untenable, or at the very least provisional. And here we begin to glimpse a material logic that very closely resembles what I have been suggesting could be a law of mimesis. So probably everybody here knows that in 2022, the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to Alain Aspect, John Clauser, and Anton Zeilinger for their pioneering work on quantum entanglement, a phenomenon that was actually first predicted by Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen in 1935 as part of a thought experiment intended to demonstrate the incompleteness of quantum theory. And so what they observed, though they did not believe it, was that two particles, once entangled, become irreversibly linked, such that the state of one is instantaneously determined by the state of the other, regardless of the distance separating them. Einstein famously called this the spooky action at a distance and rejected it as an impossibility. But subsequent experimental evidence, including this precise Bell test experiments conducted by these Nobel Prize in Physics winners, demonstrated that entanglement is both possible and fundamental, and that the act of measuring one particle alters the state of its entangled partner through something called non-local correlation. And so what this suggests, and what has since been formalized by physicists such as Carlo Rovelli in the theory of relational quantum mechanics, is that the properties of any system, its spin, its momentum, its direction, are not fixed in themselves, but emerge only in relation to an observer. And that is, reality itself is not composed of stable identities, but of entangled correlations. And in this light, observation is not passive and not neutral, it's world-forming. It's defiant of the more strict distinctions of classical physics, and therefore quite similar to the conception of mimesis and methexis that I'm working with here. So once the mimetic relation has occurred, and once the gesture, the glance, the participation has passed between beings or concepts, the system is irreversibly altered, whether or not either party acknowledges it. And so one is never quite the same again. And the mimetic event, like the entangling of particles, persists in the structure of being. The observer effect, first articulated by Heisenberg, is the principle of uncertainty, matters here too. In the quantum domain, one cannot measure both position and momentum at the same time with absolute accuracy. Getting one interferes with the other. It's a metaphysical and ontological problem. What's the real thing? It's very confusing. So this undermines any clear separation between subject and object, self and other, inside and outside, precisely the separations that dominant conceptions of mimesis have historically relied upon. The imitation model requires distance. The Girardian model, which I earlier critiqued, requires scarcity, rivalry, projection. But in the model I'm proposing, mimesis and methexis operate according to a different logic. Tausig, again, writes of magic as that which arises in the space of the mimetic faculty, a space in which the similarity is not imposed or simulated but discovered, and in that discovery, activated. Mimesis there is like a field then, a field that can be entered, shared, modulated. And what I'm speculatively calling a law of mimesis may be thought of in physical terms as akin to a field equation or a condition of relation that generates form from within. This is what Snow's birds are kind of doing as suspended participants in a spatial medium that allows the relational properties of flight, gravity, vision, and movement, and to be held, deferred, and concentrated. They are, in this sense, entangled objects. And I guess that's what my goose is also trying to do, or at least to get caught up to these guys. I'm good. Woo! These guys. That was funny. Yeah, if there's any questions or anything, we can do that now, or we can talk also at Rex's.
We're gonna go to a bar called Rex's,
It's Dundas, Bay, just north of Dundas. Yeah, something like, just walk north on Bay, and then it's on the east side. But yeah.